in the interest of time, let's go ahead and get started. I'm so grateful to Carlin for being here today to work with us on our CVs. He's got expertise and experience in the area and approached me and said, hey, what about doing something like this? It's really in line with CAT's mission to support scholarship and the ways that we present our scholarship. So thank you, Carlin, for being here. I will adjust the camera and then I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, that sounds great. Forgive me, I'm going to sit down, and it's because I'm very tall, and if I stand up, the recording will cut my head off. So I'm going to stay seated for this. Yeah, and let me go ahead and share my screen with anyone who is in Zoom. I want to talk a little bit about the reason for this presentation here today. So this was something where I attended an information meeting from the Rank and Tenure Committee. And one of the things they talked about in that meeting was how many of the CVs they get turned in for tenure review are not well organized, don't have the right information, are missing critical things. And that really kind of can impact people's tenure review, or can at least throw a wrench in the process. So prior to coming here to Xavier University, I taught in Massachusetts, and I spent a lot of time doing writing center work, and I spent a lot of time working on CVs and resumes. And so I felt that this was something I could kind of help with, since this seemed to be a need, was just to use my expertise and give some information about CVs. So this is a simple CV workshop. I'm going to start with just some basic information. Many of you probably already know this, but I just want to make sure we're on kind of the same page about everything. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at kind of an overview of what a CV is, what should go on a CV, and then I'm going to show you my CV and talk about kind of why it's organized the way it is, and then we'll look at another example that's from a graduate student at Urbana-Champaign, and it's just an online sample. And the main thing I want to talk about today, and that I want to focus on, is CVs, and this is true of resumes as well, but especially with CVs, they tend to be more flexible in terms of organization and structure. Now, this isn't necessarily true when you're going up for tenure with the Rank and Tenure Committee. They're going to expect things in a certain order, and we'll talk about that. But a lot of times with CVs, the decisions you're making are really, they come down to who you are and what your experiences are, and what the application is for, whether it's for a job application in most cases, or other applications like going up for tenure, right? And those are the things that kind of dictate how a CV is organized. So really quickly, I just want to tell you about myself, and I'd actually love to hear a little bit about each of you as well. So this is, we'll look at my full CV in a minute. I just have right now just a quick overview. So I am Professor Carlin Mackey-Stevenson. I work in the English department here. I have an MFA in fiction from the University of Massachusetts and a BA in English from the University of Nebraska. I am currently teaching here. Previously, I was the Writing Center coordinator at Massasoit Community College, and before that, I was a visiting lecturer and assistant director of the Reading and Writing Center at Westfield State. I also taught as an adjunct professor at Greenfield Community College. Those last three are all in the state of Massachusetts. So that's who I am. I'd love to hear a little bit from each of you, just like a brief overview of who you are, kind of your background as well. So we'll start over here.
Hello everyone, I'm Felicia Tarkin, and Jackson, Mississippi, where I spent most of my career at the University.
All right, great. So so we have a wide range of disciplines in this room, right? And one of the things with CVs is like, there's things that are going to be discipline specific, right? There's things that are going to be different depending, sometimes even within the same field. Like my background is creative writing. Jay and I both teach in the English department, but his background is not creative writing. It is creative writing. Okay, apologies. But other people within the English department don't have a creative writing background and are going to have different things. And I also have writing center experience, which is not something that everyone in an English department has. And so my CV is going to look a little bit different because I have to incorporate that work, right? So the first thing that's most important to know is that whatever field you're in, that you need to learn the discipline-specific expectations for a CV. And you can do that by asking colleagues to see their CV, looking online. Although I will say, looking online for any kind of resume or CV thing, you're going to get a lot of just like people trying to sell you templates, right? And so what I find useful is to look for things that are from college websites, things that are from .edus. That's how I found one of the samples that we're going to look at was from the Urbana-Champaign website. Colleges that have writing centers will often have some kind of online database, particularly if the writing center is an independent entity as opposed to a writing center that's part of a larger tutoring center. So all that being said, what I want to do is just talk a little bit about what a CV is. Again, I'm sure most of us kind of know all this stuff, but I think it's just good to make sure we're all on the same page. So a CV is a curriculum vitae, I don't know why I said vitae there, which is Latin for course of life. It's a summary. Let me go ahead and move this so we can actually read. It is a summary of one's educational and scholarly experiences and qualifications. It's not a resume. A resume will look at any part of your work experience. A CV is only concerned with your scholarship and your academic work. And so it should only include experiences and qualifications related to your scholarly work. And it should include all such qualifications and experiences, with the caveat that, like, obviously there might be certain specific jobs where some experience you have that was scholarly just isn't relevant to that job, and you may or may not want to include it. It really depends. It can be very flexible in format, and it should be tailored to each specific job or other application. And again, I say other application here because things like when you go for tenure review, you're going to be submitting an application or a CV, as will I. So this is like a general rule of thumb, basic list of content that should be in a CV in more or less this order. And then we're going to look at some examples that don't fully follow this and talk about why they don't and so on and so forth. But particularly for rank and tenure, this is the format you really want to follow if you can. Because rank and tenure is going to be a collection of faculty from different disciplines. And so there's not one discipline that you really want to necessarily lean towards. You want to have a more general kind of basic, what's the word I'm looking for here? Generic organization to your CV when you're going up for rank and tenure. So the first thing on any CV, your personal information, your name, address, phone number, email, all of that stuff. Then your education. And with all of these, you're going for most recent to most distant in the past, and you're going for highest level of education to lowest level of education.
Question,
Yeah.
did that change? Like, I've always done mine that with most recent, because I want people to see, where I am.
Mm-hmm.
But did that change? Like back in the day, did they used to want it? Like, so, I mean, I've just seen like my advisor's CV that starts in like 1980s and then builds up to now, and which seems reversed. That changed, or?
Yeah, I mean, that seems possible. In the time that I've been doing this work, the general standard has been reverse order for everything. But certainly, I mean, the thing with anything like this, and this goes for any kind of standards in any field really, is that they are always changing, right? And this is the problem with trying to think of standards as like a static thing. Standards in every field are always changing as information changes, as practices change. So it seems entirely possible to me that it used to be that you went in chronological order. I just know that in the time period that I've been looking at CVs, the general rule has been to go in reverse chronological order.
Good, I'm glad to hear that, because I've always done it anyway.
Yes. And the reason for that is really simple. I mean, when you are applying for a job, what people care about most is your most recent work experience, right? So this is true with resumes as well, right? The time you spent working at the kitchen at McDonald's in high school isn't really relevant when you're applying for a faculty position, right? Like, it's just not a relevant thing. So that's why, reverse order, we're always going to have most recent first. After you go with your highest level of education, you're going to talk about your teaching or related work experience. And I say related work experience because for example, I have writing center work on my CV. And so that, depending on how you want to organize it, that sometimes can be just lumped into one section, or it can be split out into different sections. I lump mine into one section because I consider writing center work to be very close to teaching. So I put them in one section, and I'll show you that in a minute. But depending on what the work is, you might want to have a teaching section and then another educational work related section, whatever that is. After that, you want to have your publications, generally speaking. So starting with books, and then chapters, and then articles in peer-reviewed journals, and then non-academic publications. Okay. Now you'll see on mine, I don't actually list my publications next on my CV, and I'll talk about why they're not listed next. And it just has to do with the last job I sent in my CV for not being very related to creative writing, and all my publications being creative writing. So it just didn't seem right to put the publications next because none of them were really relevant for the job that I was applying for, right? They weren't academic publications. So after publications, you're going to do your presentations. This is like conference proceedings, things like that, things where you're presenting. Then awards, fellowships, and grants. And I put and/or additional scholarship here. So when I say additional scholarship, this could be things like research projects that you worked on. It could be, which could also, of course, go under related work experience. It really depends. So what you'll see is in some of the examples we look at, there's like graduate level research projects that the person worked on that they wanted to include in their CV, but weren't really like work experience per se, right? And they actually put that higher up on the list. I'm putting it down here with grants and scholarship fellowships. Again, there's flexibility here. And the farther down this list we go, the more flexible things get, right? Then generally speaking, you'd have like professional training, professional development, things like that, professional associations. So if you're associated with some kind of large group or something like that, or if you have some kind of certification, you're gonna want to put that there. Service, both service at like your college or department, service at, again, like a professional association, something like that. And then any other additional content. And this is where it gets really wide open. There's a lot of things you could want to include depending on your specific experiences. I have editorial work, for example, on my CV because I spent time as an undergraduate and as a graduate student doing editorial work before realizing that I didn't like doing editorial work. But I still want to put it on my CV because it's still experience I had, and it still informs like my writing center work and things like that. And then finally, references would always go at the end. And you don't always have to include references on a CV. In fact, some places when you're applying will tell you whether to include them on a CV or include them separately. And so you really just want to follow whatever the guidelines are to where you're applying. If there's a separate place to turn in references, I would generally leave references off at that point and just put them in the separate place where they're being turned in.
Quick question or comment.
Yes.
I thank you for that because those of us who are really old, all of our professors have retired and the references section looks kind of weird. So
yeah,
I will take mine off my CV and that'll be great. Thanks for that.
Yeah, yes. So yeah, I mean, now sometimes it is expected on the CV. Sometimes that's where they expect to find references. So my general rule of thumb is if I'm turning in a CV and the guidelines don't say anything about turning in references separately, then I put it on my CV. If they do say something about turning in references separately, they have a place to turn in, then I take it off the CV. And that's usually how I do it. Yeah, I mean, references get tricky, the longer time goes on, like my references that I have, well, I don't have any on my CV currently, but the ones that I used when I was applying to this job, now some of those are getting on a few years since I've spoken to them, right? I mean, it gets tricky as time goes on with references. My general advice would be if you are applying for a new job, applying for a promotion, applying for tenure, you're up for tenure, and you are concerned about your references, just get back in touch with them or find new people to fill in as references. One nice thing when you're a university professor is you have people around you who can serve as your references. Your department chair can serve as a reference. Your dean can serve as a reference. Colleagues can serve as a reference, although sometimes people want more like managerial people who are kind of above you on some kind of hierarchy as your references. So you can be kind of flexible with that. But yeah, generally speaking, I would update references if it's been a long time. I would get back in touch with the people and see if it's still okay to use them as a reference. And I only say this as someone who, this never happened to me, but I knew people who had asked for referrals or references from former professors, and those professors said sure, and then didn't give very glowing referrals, and it really like set those people back. So I just think that's something that's good, with any kind of references or letters of recommendation, to try and keep that up to date and keep it with people that you feel very confident are going to give you a glowing review whenever you can. Any other questions about this general list? Okay, so this is like general, generic, but things can look a lot differently. They can be very different depending on the field. Generally, the first 3-4 items here are going to be pretty set in stone in most disciplines. And maybe presentations as well. After that, there's a lot more room for kind of maneuvering. So I'll show you the CV that I currently have, and this is actually a little bit out of date. So can everyone see this? Do I need to zoom in a little bit? Okay.
I can see it.
Okay.
Can we see it on Zoom okay? Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Okay, great. So this is my current CV. And I probably should have changed my phone number and stuff since this is being recorded, but I don't imagine it's going to be too much of an issue. So my background is in creative writing and then in writing center work. And the last time I was using this CV, I was sending it in because my wife had been hired here and we were negotiating a couple hire, which wound up working out. That's why I'm here. When I was sending this CV in, one of the things that I wasn't sure about was how much my publications would be important, because my publications are all creative writing. And as you'll see when we get to them, I haven't actually published anything in quite a while because I've been working on a novel for a long time. So the publication section didn't feel super vital to me. I felt it was more important to stress my writing center work and my work in that field. Whether that was the right call or not, I mean, it worked out. So, so the way this is organized right now, I put all of my teaching and tutoring experience under academic experience. And the reason for this is I really wanted to be able to have my employment history in academia in kind of one continuous timeline. And I really felt that the writing center work was related to the teaching work that I'd done. So I have updated this since I got hired here, although I don't have actually all the classes that I've taught here. I need to add a couple classes to this. Now, right now, I have explanations of each course. As I teach more classes, I will probably cut those down or drop them entirely at certain points. At the time that I was last filling this out, I had taught for a long time at Westfield State, but mostly just teaching the same classes over and over again. And so I felt like I needed to flesh out what those classes were to give a visual sense to the amount of time that I'd put into teaching, right? Now that I've spent more time here and I've taught more classes and I'm teaching a wider variety of classes, that's less and less of a concern. So at a certain point, I'll probably go in and take this information out, or at least cut it down to just a few sentences. And this is one of those things where it's like, you kind of have to think about the experience of somebody reading this, right? So if they are reading a resume and you just have like your courses listed and you've only taught like 3 or 4 courses, which was the case on this resume before, or on this CV before rather, people are going to look at that and some part of them is going to say, oh, that's not a very long teaching section, right? So there's a little bit of like psychology that you're playing around with here, where you're thinking about like what is going to be the gut reaction people have to this, even if they're logically not thinking that, even if they're trying to tell themselves, no, we just need to look at the time periods here. There's also going to be the psychological reaction. Now, For things like the rank and tenure committee, I don't know how much any of this will matter. They're going to be more familiar with the courses taught at this university generally anyway. And so I probably would take these out for rank and tenure. And then what I've done here is I've included writing center work in the same section. And the way I organized it was to organize it by school. And that it just worked very conveniently for me because I've always been at kind of one place at a time. But when I was at Westfield State University, I was teaching and doing writing center work. And so this seemed the best way to organize it in the most clear way to show kind of my experience. So I worked at Massasoit Community College. I worked there for a very brief amount of time as the writing center coordinator before getting this job here. And then before that, I was at Westfield State where I was a visiting lecturer. And so I put my courses here. And then I also have my work as the Reading and Writing Center Assistant Director and as a professional consultant before I was the Assistant Director. And again, I'm going in reverse chronological order here, right? Then I have my time at Greenfield Community College. And I also, I will almost certainly be dropping out. This is my graduate level teaching. But again, this was about filling out my teaching resume. I probably won't include this in the future, even though I do kind of think we should all own our graduate level work. But I know that for some people, seeing graduate level teaching on a CV is like, oh, well, that shouldn't really count. That's not really.
Well, then psychologically, then it can look like padding.
Right, exactly. And so I will probably be taking this out the next time I use this CV, right? The next time I need to turn it in for something. Then I have my conference presentations, which are both in writing center conferences. And that's why I wanted to go with these next, because I felt they were more relevant as somebody who was applying. When I was applying to the English department here, because I was applying as a couple hire, I wasn't applying specifically to do creative writing or specifically to do any one thing. So I wanted to really highlight the more academic parts of my CV because I felt that would be a more generally applicable framework for it. And so that's why I have my conference presentations, then I have some professional development, then I have my editorial work, and then down here I have my publications. And again, these are sort of creative, these are all poems and stories that have been published. The last one was published in 2014. I've been working on a novel since then, which is why there's no publication since then. And so that's there. And then at the very end, I have an award. And the reason the award is at the very end and not earlier, as I showed you in the general overview, is because this award is from my undergraduate institution. It was a third place award for a poetry prize as an undergraduate. I feel like it should be there because it's still an award for something, but it doesn't feel like a particularly relevant or important award. Does that kind of make sense? So that's why I put it at the bottom of my CV. Okay. Any questions about any of this so far?
Is your recommendation for back up to the presentation or in publications too, to do it in the writing style of our discipline?
Yes, that would be my recommendation. As much as possible to follow, like if you use MLA, if you use APA, if you use Chicago in your field, to follow those styles. Now, again, because my background is creative writing, I've generally used this more kind of like open list of publications. Part of it for me is because sometimes you get a couple poems, for example, in one issue of a journal. So I wanted to just kind of combine those into one thing. Next time, when I go up for rank and tenure, I will be putting this into MLA, right? These publications, and I will be moving them up the list because I know that for the rank and tenure committee, they're going to expect that more generic standard organization on a CV.
A quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about courses.
Mm-hmm.
You said you would take them out. Did you say?
I would take out the descriptions of the courses, or at least reduce them significantly. Especially with things, things like composition and rhetoric. I mean, every university has composition and rhetoric. So there's really not a need for this level of explanation. Like I said, this is a little bit I'm going to be updating this when I go up for my 3-year review. And I'll be probably removing a lot of that. Maybe all of it. I haven't decided yet.
And this would be a nice time for me, if you don't mind me doing a little personal thing.
Absolutely.
That, so Kat, when Caroline started doing this workshop, I want this on the recording, Kat really distanced itself from tenure advice. Now, this is really good advice for a PhD.
Yeah.
But we say always in Kat, you get tenure in the biology department, in the mass comm department, you don't get it right? So anything that you do, we would still recommend run it by your department chair.
Absolutely.
Because you want to be in line with your departmental expectations. So this is pretty good stuff that you can use and organize it.
Yes.
That's the point is he found out these people weren't telling a good story through their CVs, right? And that's what we're really trying to do.
Yeah.
But just do know that we are always so tiptoe around this in CAT because the worst thing we could do is give bad advice and then they said, well, CAT told me to do this and now I didn't get tenure. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is just support. So what I'm saying for support is run it by your department.
Yep.
Be sure that those are the people writing letters.
And if you know someone who's on the rank and tenure committee, ask them if they have like expectations, right? So
past rank and tenure.
Or past rank and tenure, right? So for example, we have a faculty member in the English department who just got done serving on the rank and tenure committee. And she was the one who was talking about this issue at the meeting. And so that was part of the impetus for this whole workshop. But again, I do want to clarify, like, I'm not suggesting that if you do this, you will get tenure, right? Like, I'm not making any promises. But the point is that, I know that rank and tenure and are going to be looking for these things. And I also know that whatever else you're using your CV for, the more you can fit the expectations of your field and the expectations of the people who are going to be looking at it, the better the odds that you are going to get that job or get that promotion or get that, or get tenure or get whatever it is, right? And a lot of this really comes down to thinking about why things are organized the way they are, and then learning about the expectations in the field and just letting those two things kind of bounce off of each other, right? So always go with expectations in the field first, but then within that framework, where is there room for you to make the story your own, your own story of your work, and to frame it in a way that fits the thing you're applying to, right? Because that's the other part of the equation, right? I mean, and sometimes depending on what it is, they might even tell you what their expectations are. There might be guidelines listed, and absolutely, if there's guidelines listed, follow those guidelines, right? Okay, so the other thing I want to do here is I want to look at an example. Again, so this is a sample CV from University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And the reason I want to look at this is because, first of all, because it's different than mine. And so I think it's good to look at like why it's different. And then I also just think it's good to see different approaches to some of the things we were talking about with mine. So for example, so this is, I don't actually think this is probably anyone actually named Rachel Green. I think that's just the name that they came up with for this. Obviously, 555-1234 is probably not their phone number, right? However, I think this does a good job of presenting kind of a different way of approaching this. So this is my guess would be looking at this CV is this is a recent graduate student. And the reason I think that is because the dissertation is being listed right away at the top here, right? And so generally when people are applying for a first job right out of graduate school, if they wrote a dissertation for graduate school, that's going to be something they're going to foreground, right? Particularly if they're applying as someone who is ABD, all but dissertation, meaning they haven't defended yet, but they're on the job market. Having information about their dissertation and their committee is going to be important because they don't actually have a PhD yet. They're almost there, right? So we can notice a few differences here. One thing, right? So teaching and advising is being listed. This is how they're choosing to frame their experience as teaching and advising. And in this case, they are going by job title rather than university. Okay. So we have composition instructor, which they did at University of Illinois. We have literature instructor, which they did at University of Illinois. And so we have a number of things at University of Illinois, and then University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and we have these different job titles. And under these job titles, we have like duties, like things that they did as part of that job. Now, the reason for this is because their teaching experience is only that, right? So they don't have a lot of teaching experience to put in their CV. So rather than have teaching and have this one little thing and then have other work after that, they are foregrounding a lot of the other work, and the teaching is sitting down there at the bottom, right? And a lot of this work is still very, very relevant. So I mean, some of it is teaching, literature instructor, right? So they have all of this different experience, but they're combining it all together, and they're not listing out specific courses because in all reality, as a graduate student, you're generally not teaching a wide range of courses, right? You're teaching one, maybe two courses. I taught 2 courses the whole time I was in graduate school, right? So mostly composition and then once creative writing. That was my graduate school experience. Then we get research experience next. And this is something that's very interesting. My guess here would be that this is a sign that this is a person is applying for some kind of research fellowship or research position, and that's why they're putting this research experience so high, right? Now, I mean, doctoral researcher is something that anyone with a PhD could put on their CV, right? Like if you have a PhD, you did doctoral research at some point. Now, my guess is that this is relevant to the job or the thing they're applying to, and that's why they put this up. Then we get publications, and here you'll see they are in MLA formatting more or less. The thing with some of the formatting with these citations, like if something's forthcoming, for example, you can't necessarily put a publication date on that because it's forthcoming, right? So you always have to kind of, and every style guide, if you're using APA, if you're using MLA, they will have somewhere published online or in their handbooks, they will have what to do when there's information missing. They will have things to put in if this information is missing. And then we get conference presentations and then honors and awards, then professional service. So for me, I put editorial work in mind because that's the only professional service that I felt I could put. Here she's including editorial work along with other professional service. And generally speaking, if it's listed as professional service, that means they weren't compensated for it, right? So this is work they did that didn't receive direct monetary compensation, but instead, gave them credit towards service or something like that. In a case of things like working as an editor for a literary journal when you're in graduate school, that's something that even if you're not getting paid for it, although a lot of times you are getting paid for it, but even if you're not getting paid for it, that can really help down the road when you're applying for jobs, and that's why graduate students will do that sometimes. And then we get some university service. This is more general service to the university as opposed to discipline-specific service. We get professional memberships here at the end, and then references. Okay? All right, any questions about any of this?
So for mine, I've got, would you go back to service?
Yeah.
I've got, oh no, professional memberships, that's it. So I've got, so what I've done under each one of those, APA, I've got a ton of, right? So all these positions I had in APA. So I just put it under professional. So I've got this under professional activities, and I've got affiliations. So I've got the heading of professional activities, then affiliations, then APA, then a list of all the service things I've done through APA.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And one of the things,
professional service?
No, so the exact wording really is up to you. I mean, you can look at, and I did look at many different samples of CVs, and I saw all different terminology for these things, right? You can call things whatever you want, and sometimes it makes a lot of sense to just call them whatever they're called at the place or in your field or at the place where you were working. Because even like things like that, like what service is called can change from university to university, right? And so one of the things to ask yourself when you're putting something on the CV is, what are the categories I'm going to use and what categories does this go into? And you figure out the organization from that level. One of the best pieces of advice that I can give you is figure out the big high level categories first, so that you can then figure out what to put in each category, right? So depending on who you are, right? Like, so for example, if I had spent a whole lot of time doing writing center work and then had been a teacher for a long time, I might want to separate those two out, and I might want to have a category that said teaching and a category that said, tutoring work or writing center work or administrative work, because a lot of it was administrative, right? And the reason I might want to separate those out might be because I'm trying to show that I have two different parts of my career, where I spent a lot of time doing one thing and then a lot of time doing another. In my actual case, I was constantly doing both for most of that time, which is why I've incorporated them together. So that's what I mean, like start with what are the big, like high level categories you want to do, And then you can have subcategories absolutely within this, right? So that's, for me, I have academic experience, and then I have each university has its own subcategory within that, right? But you start with the highest level categories, and then you work down to subcategories, and you figure out how you're going to organize it and where everything's going to slot in, right? And so for something like service, depending on your exact experiences, you might want to have a couple different categories of service. You might want to have, like, for example, with my professional development, I went back and forth about how to organize that. And there was times where I actually separated out the different kinds of professional development, but each of those sections felt like one of them just had one thing, and then one of them had a bunch of like specific workshops that I did to learn about teaching as a graduate student and as a writing center consultant before I became the assistant director. So it felt like one of them was super long and one of them was super short. And so it didn't really make sense to keep those separate. It made more sense to put them together.
Yep.
Right. So it's just a lot of decisions like that.
When I first started in CAT, I had that, my publications and presentations separated out by my psychology and then my faculty development. And then faculty development became,
Right.
now I just can figure it out. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
I'd like a quick question about, maybe, I think you pretty much covered it, but sometimes like I'm working with students, for example, like this past year, I helped a lot of students secure grants, fellowships, and funding, and I'm named on it as a mentor or as a faculty member. Yeah, but it's not my fellowship. It's not my grant. It's for the student. But my presence. My letter of recommendation helped, and I'm named as a mentor. Where would something like that fall?
Well, so the first thing I would do is I would ask within your discipline, look within your discipline to see if there's any specific guidelines within that discipline, right? I would talk to other people in your department and see if anyone has similar experience and how they put it up the CV. And I would find a model if you can't, if no one in your department has done that, I would find a model within your field of somebody who's done that. But failing all that, my general sense would be I would probably put that under service, right? As something, service generally, I look at it as like things faculty do that they're not directly compensated for, but that contributes to their academic institution in some way. And depending on the levels of service, you might even have sections where it's like kind of more formal service stuff where you are, like this, where I'm here and it's like being advertised by CAT and things like that, versus more informal service where you're meeting with students one-on-one and helping them with grant applications, right? You could even have kind of categories that break that up.
Yeah, one thing I just want to see what the language I use. I've got a section that's at the end of my stuff, right? My presentations, publications at the end of it. I've titled it Undergraduate Mentee Scholarship. And I put things there, so it's like all my students who've been, so my name's not on it, but all my students who've been published in Zula and Access, which is our, publication here at Xavier, students who presented at formal, I didn't do festival scholars, but because again, that would just get, but students who presented at conferences, whether or not I would do grants, like all that, and I just got it marked so that it doesn't look like padding, right? I'm not trying to say this is mine, but it's undergraduate.
Mm-hmm. And that's, the other thing, like, to keep in mind with all of this is that the number one goal is to clearly articulate the work and the experience you've done, right? So at the end of the day, the most important criteria for any of this is like, does this clearly articulate what I did, right? That's every part of your CV needs to be able to answer that question with a yes, right? It has to clearly articulate what your experience is, what your qualifications are, right? And so anything you're choosing to put on there, particularly again, once you get outside of, your education level, your teaching / other academic experience, your publications and your conference presentations, once you get outside of those things, it really opens up a lot in terms of like what you can do and what you can put in, right? And so you really can kind of make it your own. Make sure you're highlighting those things because those are the things that are pretty universal. Like everyone wants to know what your highest level of education was. Everyone wants to know all of your teaching and other academic work experience. Everyone wants to know your publications. Everyone wants to know your conference presentations. And probably any kind of research project. So this is something where I'm not in the sciences, but I'm sure in the sciences there's ways of putting in like research projects where you're not necessarily publishing anything, but you've done some kind of research on some, amino acids or something like that, right? And so, things like that, all of that stuff like has to be there. But beyond that, you can really make it something that fits your course of life, right? To use the English translation of curriculum vitae, right? Okay, great. Okay, so I am able to stick around for a bit, and I'm happy to look one-on-one at CVs that people have brought in. Really quickly, I want to put up and just have this on the Zoom recording, some contact info for me. So if you do want to at some point come, I'm happy to like review CVs with people and kind of just go over one-on-one what I see and what you could do. So my office is in trailer 2, which is the one by the library. I'm in one of the temporary trailers right now, and I'm in. Well, you say that, but I have a window at that office, which I didn't have in admin. So in some ways, it's an upgrade for me.
I do think we should have a crawfish boil or some kind of party outside of it.
Yes, I think that would be great. So yeah, I'm in office C. I do have an office phone, but it is not plugged in. I don't know why it's not plugged in, but I just put my cell phone here if you want to call me, and then my email is cmacias@zula.edu. So I'm happy to meet and to talk one-on-one about CVs or really any kind of work. So I do have a writing center background, and it's one of the things that I kind of miss a little bit being here as a faculty member is being able to do that kind of one-on-one working with people on their writing. So I'm always happy to chat with people. Yeah. All right. Thank you for coming. Yes.
We appreciate. Thank you for coming. Questions or comments before we turn off the recording?
So do you think, and maybe after somebody a little bit established in their career, dropping all the grad school stuff?
Yes, I would generally recommend that. And it's not because, there's things where it's like, this is my personal feeling on it versus this is what the expectations are, right? My personal feeling is graduate student work is still work and should still count. And certainly things like a dissertation should always be on your CV. I'm just realizing I should put my master's thesis on there. I don't know why it's not on there. Because you can go to the University of Massachusetts library and download it if you want. I don't recommend it. It's not very good, but it's there. I would always recommend things like that. But yeah, I would generally put like some of the like work, the teaching and the things like that, I would generally take off after a while. I mean, here's the thing, right? Like everyone will sit here and tell you like, this is the standard, this is the right way to do it. But everyone will disagree about what that standard is, right? So there's plenty of people out there who would be totally fine with their graduate level work being on there. The way I look at it is, I know there's people who are going to be like, oh, this person's putting their graduate work on here, and they're going to want to shove it to the side for that reason. And that's why I'm going to take it off, right? Because I don't want to give them the opportunity to do that, right? And that's one of the ways I kind of approach thinking about things like this is like, what's going to be a disqualifying factor for someone? Not for everyone, but for someone. And how can I try and avoid those as much as possible? And sometimes you can't avoid them, right? Like, and because you can't know who's going to read this, right? You can look up online who's on your committee, right? If you're applying for a job or whatever, but you're not going to know their specific feelings about whether graduate level work goes on a CV or not, right? So my general approach is if I think it's something that someone might dock me points for, I'll take it off. Now, in the case of my current CV, because at the last time that I was using it for anything, not updating it, but using it for anything, I felt like I needed to have that graduate level work on there just to like sort of padded out, right? To use Elizabeth's terminology. I sort of had to weigh that. I had to go back and forth and weigh, like, should it be on there? Should it not be on there? And, you know, part of me wants to say, like, no, let's all keep our graduate level work on there and let's fight against this idea. But, you know, that's easy to say when you have a full-time job and you're like, you know.
Yeah.
So I would generally recommend, if you think there's a reason why something might be a disqualifying factor, because the other thing to think about, right, is like, and I don't know how many of you have ever sat on a search committee for a job or done any kind of like I used to read for literary journals as a graduate student, where you would get a giant pile of novels of people who are like trying to get their first novel published through some contest. And you would have to, your only job as a reader was to go through and like weed out the obvious no's, right? Just say like, no, no, no. And when you're doing that, part of what you're doing is just looking for reasons to disqualify people.
Yeah.
You're not really looking at the quality of the books. You're looking for reasons to disqualify them, right? And that's something that happens with job searches, right? Like you're going through, you have like 150 applicants that you have to sort through, and you have to look at all their CVs. And so you're looking for reasons to disqualify people, right? Like if you see something where you're like, oh, that's not how that's supposed to be, you're just going to toss that CV, right? So one of the considerations that I would think about is like, what's a reason why someone might put me in, we used to call it the slush pile in doing for like literary journals and stuff, which is just like the stuff that's not even going to really get considered. So what's something that someone might put my CV in a slush pile? And how can I avoid giving them that reason, right? That's something I would try and think about. And again, that can be very discipline specific also, right? So like if I had at some point in my career switched disciplines and was like doing the sciences now, I would not put any of my creative writing on my CV, right? Because I don't think that would really be relevant. I mean, maybe in biology you could tell me that that would be relevant. I don't know. But I would generally not think that that would be relevant. So I would take it off, because somebody might look at it and be like, why is this person putting his like published poems on here, and then use that as an excuse to put it in the slush pile. So, yeah. So that's something I would just be thinking about. Any other questions or comments? All right. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Please use the QR code. We appreciate you. Tell your colleagues that this was useful, and then we'll broadcast the recording for people too.
Yep.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.